Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video we're going to make a tic-tac-toe game in React Native. The game looks like this. When you click on tiles you get X's and O's, and when somebody wins we see an alert saying who the winner was. This is a very simple tutorial and it's designed for beginners, so let's begin. Okay, to start off with I'm going to create a new project, and I'm using the Expo XDE to create a project, but you don't have to use that. You can use plain React Native if you'd like. I'm going to name my project Tic-Tac-Toe. And while that loads, I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. Okay, I've got my project up and running in the simulator over here, and all of the code is opened up in Visual Studio Code. The first thing I'm going to do is create a tic-tac-toe board so I'll have something to work with. So I'm going to delete out this default text that they give us, and I'm going to start off with a view, and I'm going to give it a style called styles.tile, which is going to be a single tile in our game. So let's come down here and create a new style called tile. And we'll start off by giving it a border width of 1 and a width of, let's say, 100 and a height of 100, and see how that looks. As you can see, we've got a square here. And for the board, we're going to make 3 rows of 3 squares each. And then we will adjust the border width according to what position that tile is in. So let's go and make 3 tiles there. And these are stacked on top of each other, so we need to put them inside of a view which has a style of flex direction row so that they will stack horizontally. And save that and see how that looks. Looks good. So now we can add 2 more of those, and we should have a grid that we can work with. Okay, perfect. Now we can come in and we'll need to customize the styles a little bit. Basically, we're going to remove the border on the outer pieces. So each tile will be slightly different. What I'm going to do is convert the style to an array. So I can give it the base tile style, and then we'll add an additional style here. And so for the first one, it'll be a border left width of 0 and a border top width of 0. And that looks good. So what I'm going to do first is add these array and the empty style things here, and then I'm going to replace all of the tiles that I had already made. So it'll be a little bit faster. Oops. Okay, and now one by one we'll go through and remove the borders. So the second one will need a border top width of 0. The third one will need a border top width of 0 and a border right width of 0. See how that looks. Okay. For the one right here, we just need to reset the border left width to 0. The middle one I think will actually keep all of its borders, and then the one down here will have a border right width of 0. Okay, for the bottom row, we want the border bottom width 0, border left width 0, border bottom width of 0 for the center one, and for the right side, border bottom width 0 and border right width of 0. Okay, and there's our tic-tac-toe board. I think I want to make the border widths a little bit thicker. I think that would look a little nicer, so let's set it to 10 and see how that looks. Okay, and that looks pretty good. Now, just as an experiment, let's try to put some of the X's and O's in here and get that styled the way we'd like it, and then we can go in and start adding in the mechanics of the game itself. So in order to put a piece, we're going to need to put something inside of these actual views. So we'll have to close them like this. And for the styles, we want to use an icon, I believe. So let's import material community icons as icon. That way we don't have to type out material community icons, we just type in icon. And we'll import it from React Native Vector Icons. And these come with Expo, so if you're using Expo, you don't need to do anything. If you're not using Expo, you may need to install this library, which is very easy to do. And let's try putting in an icon here. We'll give it a name of, I'm just guessing, but I think the X icon is called close. And let's see how that looks. Okay, so we get a small X in there, but we want to style it a little bit. So let's add a style on there, and we'll call it styles.tileX. And down here, we will add a new style called tileX. And I'd like the X's, I think, to have a color of red, and we'll make the O's green. And let's make the font size quite a bit larger. Let's set it to 60 maybe. And we want to align items center and justify content center. So hopefully that should put it right in the center. It didn't, so maybe we need to add a flex 1. Okay, so we need to figure out how to put these in the center of the view, but we can come back to that a little later. Let's add another style called tile O, and we'll set the color to green, and everything else should be the same. And let's practice putting the O in there. So that will be icon name equals. I'm not sure what the name of the O icon is, so I'll need to look that up on the icon documentation page. So if I come over here, I'm at the React Native Vector Icons library website. If I scroll down a little bit, here are all the icon libraries we have access to, but we're using the material community icons. So if I click on that, I should get a list of icons that are available. And for the O, I think I should maybe search for circle. So we'll search for that and find one that we like. I think I like this one right here, circle-outline. This one looks good too, but it's a little bit longer to type, so let's go with circle-outline. So in the name here, I'll put circle-outline, save that, and there we go. Okay, now that we've got a decent looking UI for our board and our individual pieces, now we want to hook up the game mechanics itself. So I'm going to add a constructor here. And don't forget to call super props. And we want to set a state that is going to hold the state of the game. So we want to hold a couple of pieces of information. We want to know whose turn it is, player 1 or player 2. And we also want to know which pieces are filled out in which tile. And so for the pieces in the tile, I think a good data structure for that would be a 2D array, which is first indexed by the row and then by the column. And so let's call that game state. And we'll just initialize it at first to a regular array, but we'll initialize it in a function in just a second. And for the player's turn, let's make a variable called current player. And I think we'll use a 1 for player 1 and a -1 for player 2. So we'll start off by making the current player player 1. Now to initialize the game, we should make a function, and let's call it initialize game. And what this will do is it'll set the game state to be a 2D array, and I think what we'll also do is we'll have a value of 1 for an X, a value of -1 for an O, and a value of 0 for a blank tile. So what we'll do is this.setState, and we'll set game state equal to some array. And to do a 2D array, we can put brackets here and then put array inside of there. So we're going to initialize it to be all zeros, because when we start the game, we want the entire board to be empty. Okay. Now we need to call initialize game. So back in our constructor, we will type this.initialize game. So as soon as the component is loaded, it will initialize the game. And we're getting a yellow box error down here. It says can't call set state on a component that is not yet mounted. So I think it doesn't like that we're trying to initialize the game in the constructor. So let's add the lifecycle method component did mount. And in there we will initialize the game, because this gets called once the component is mounted, and that should be good. Okay, now that we've got our game state initialized, we are ready to start rendering the board according to the game state. And after thinking about it a little bit, I think if I remove the align items and all of this stuff from the icon styles, that should help with our centering, and it looks like the icons are now centered. So what we want to do is basically render something specific for each tile based on what that particular value in the array looks like. So let's make a function up here called render icon, and it will take a row and a column value, and it will return back the icon that we're supposed to use. And sometimes we won't need an icon because that cell may be empty. So in that case, we'll return a blank view. So in this function, we'll first grab the value, which is going to be this .state.gameState at row and col. And then we'll switch on the value, and we'll say if the case is where the value is 1, that means we want to have an X. So in that case, we'll return this icon. If the case is that it's a -1, we want to have an O. So in that case, we'll return this icon. And in the case where it's a 0 or any other value, then we want to return a blank view. So let's test that out now. We can replace the icon here with this dot, I'll put it in brackets, this dot render icon, and we have to give it the row and column that we're in, which is 0, 0 for this one. And for this one, we'll say this dot render icon. And since we're in the top row, that's 0 for the row, and we're in the second position, so it's a 1 for the column because the arrays are 0 indexed. So if we save that, we should get nothing in there. And we actually got an error saying this dot state.gameState. I think the problem here is that we're trying to access a 2D array, and maybe we should actually initialize this like that. Okay, there we go. So the problem was that it was trying to render the icons when the game state was initially just a 1D array, and it was trying to access the two-dimensional aspects of it. So if we initialize it up here in our state, we don't need to worry about that. All right, and now as a test, we can change some of these values. So let's set this one to a 1 and this one to a -1. We should get back to our X and our O like we had initially. So what that means is now, as we're playing the game, we can set values in this array, and it will update the game board accordingly. So let's go ahead and change all of these to show the correct icon. So this is going to be 0, 2. And I'm going to do this for the rest of the views. I'll probably speed this part up so that you don't have to watch me do this for all of them. Okay, now I've got all the views set up to display the icon at their appropriate position in the array. And now what we need to do is allow the tiles themselves to be clicked. And to do that, we'll need to change the view to something that's clickable. So we'll use a touchable opacity. I'm going to scroll up to the top, and I'm going to import touchable opacity from React Native. And I'm going to swap out all of these views for touchable opacity views, or components. So I'll swap all of these out. All right, now all of the tiles are touchable opacities, but we need to give them an onPress event. So I'm going to add a function on here called onPress. And what it's going to do is call a function called this.onTilePress, and it will also pass in the row and column position, which we're going to need so that we can update the array in the correct location. So up here I'm going to create a new function called onTilePress, which also takes a row and a column. And we will implement this a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to update all of the touchable opacities to call the onTilePress function with the appropriate row and column. Okay, now I've got all of the touchable opacities calling onTilePress with the appropriate row and column. And so now we can implement the onTilePress function, which is just going to update the game state array and set the value based on whoever's turn it is. So in order to do that, we need to first figure out whose turn it is. So let's get a variable called current player, which is going to be this .state.currentPlayer. And since we decided that a 1 corresponds to player 1 and also corresponds to an x, we can just say that player 1 is always x's. And since player 2 corresponds to a -1 and a -1 also corresponds to an O, we'll say that player 2 is O's. So what that means is we can set the value of the array equal to whatever the current player is. So then all we need to do is grab the array from the state and then change the value at row and column. And the way that arrays work in React Native, I think we need to actually make a copy of the array and then set the array value and then set the state again. Otherwise it may not update correctly. So what we'll do is create a variable called array, and that will be equal to this .state.gamestate.slice, which I think is how you can make a copy of an array. And then we'll set array row call equal to current player, and then we'll do this .setState gamestate equal to array. So let's try that out. If we click these, we get all x's, as you can see, and that's because we're not swapping out who the current player is. So the next thing we need to do after a tile is pressed is switch the current player. So let's put some comments here. Set the correct tile, switch to other player. Oops. So let's create a new variable called next player, and that's going to be equal to a 1 if the current player is -1, or a -1 if the current player is 1. So let's use the ternary operator in this case. We'll say if the current player equals 1, we're going to have a -1. Otherwise, a +1. And then we'll do another set state for current player will be the next player. Save that. And now as we click tiles, we can see that they're alternating between X's and O's. And I think another bug might be if we click the same tile, we can swap this out, but in a normal game, you shouldn't be allowed to change a tile that's already been decided on. So in our onTilePress, let's add some code that doesn't allow a already decided tile to be changed. So don't allow tiles to change. So we'll create a variable called value, and that's going to be equal to this .state.gamestate row call. And we'll say if value does not equal 0, we're going to return. Because remember, it's 0 if it's blank, and it'll be a 1 or a -1 if it's not blank. I'm going to change this comment to say, I'll keep it the same. Okay. Now we can save and reload and test this out. And now if I click the same tile, it won't be allowed to change. Okay. Now the final thing we need to do in the onTilePress is we want to check for a winner. So every time a new tile is pressed, we want to check if that player has won the game. And I think one way that we could do this is, well, first of all, if you aren't familiar with the rules of Tic-Tac-Toe, a winner occurs when they have the same pieces either horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And since we decided to use 1 and -1 as our values, what we can do is sum the rows together, and suppose that these are all 1, 1, 1. If we sum them together and that equals 3, then we know that player 1 has won. Or if it equals -3, then we know that player 2 has won. And if they don't equal 3 or -3, then nobody has won on that row, so we'll check the next row and the next row. We'll do the same thing for the columns and the same thing for the diagonals. So let's make a function right here called getWinner. And this function will return if a 1 if player 1 won, a -1 if player 2 won, or a 0 if no one has won. So right here we will create a variable called sum, and then let's make a block of code called check rows maybe. And we should loop through all the rows and sum them up. So we'll say var I equals 0, I is less than, and let's make a constant right here called numtiles, I guess. We'll set that equal to 3 because we'll always have 3 here, and that will be the extent of our looping. And we want our sum to be equal to this.state.gameState. Let's actually pull this out into a variable so we don't have to type that out every single time. So we'll say r equals this.state.gameState. And our sum here will be ri, so we're on the ith row, and 0 plus array I1 plus array I2. And we'll check our sum. If the sum equals 3, then that means player 1 has won, so we will immediately return a 1. Else, if the sum equals -3, then that means that player 2 has won, so we'll immediately return a -1. And if the sum is not 3 or not -3, that doesn't mean that nobody has won. It just means that we need to go on to the next iteration of the loop and check the next row, or potentially check columns or diagonals. So this should be good for our rows, and we want to do something similar for the columns. So we'll add check columns here. And we want to make another loop that goes from 0 up to 3. But in this case, we're just going to swap the I and the number for the array. So we're going to set sum equal to array 0i plus array 1i plus array 2i. And the logic here will be exactly the same, so I'm just going to copy and paste this. Okay, and finally we're going to check the diagonals. And I don't think we need to do a loop for the diagonals, we'll just hard code it. So we'll have here 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 2. So let's set our sum equal to array 0, 0 plus array 1, 1 plus array 2, 2. And if that equals 3, we know that player 1 won. Otherwise, if it equals -1, player 2 won. So we'll put that there. And that was this diagonal. Now we need to check this diagonal. So let's just copy and paste this code here. And we need to change the array values. So let's take a look. This one is in row 0. It's in row 2, column 0. So we'll put a 2, 0 there. This one is 1, 1. It's the same as this diagonal, so we can keep array 1, 1 the same. And then this one is in row 0, column 2. So we'll change this to 0, 2. And that checks all the diagonals. And if we've gone through all of these checks and we haven't found a winner yet, that means there are no winners. So we'll return a 0. All right, and now in our on-tile press, we can add another block of code, check for winners, and we'll make a variable winner equals this.getWinner. And we could say if winner equals 1, then maybe we'll do an alert and say player 1 has won. So let's come up to the top and we'll import alert. And right here we'll say alert.alert, player 1 is the winner. And then since we already have a winner, we can go ahead and make a new game. So we'll say this dot initialize game, which should reset our game board. Else, if winner equals -1, then we'll do an alert that says player 2 is the winner, and we will once again initialize a new game. And if no one has won, we'll keep going. So let's test that out. I'm going to let player 1 win, so do that. And then we say player 1 is the winner, and it has reset our game. Now let's try to let player 2 win. And that looks like a bug because we always want player 1 to start off with, so let's fix that. That should be in our initialized game. We set the game state equal to this array, but we also want to set the current player to be player 1. Let's save and test out that. So let's let player 2 win. We get a note that says player 2 is the winner, and we're starting off on player 1. And I think there's another bug, which is if there's a draw. So let me do that. Oops, I accidentally won the game. All right, so if we have a draw, let's see, you should go there, and you should do that, block that. Okay, so now the game is tied, and the get winner algorithm has worked properly by saying there's no winner, but we also need to check, are all the game pieces filled? Otherwise, we'll just be stuck in this state perpetually, and we won't be able to create a new game. So we could add some checks in the get winner, or we could check to see if the game is full, but I think what I want to do is just add a button down at the bottom called new game, and if you click on that, it's just going to create a new game for you. So I'll import button here, and then down below the board, we will add a button. Title will be called new game, and the on press will be this.on new game press, which we'll implement right here on new game press, and all we'll do is call initialize game. So now at any point in time we can click new game and it gives us a brand new game. And let's add another view here with a little bit of padding. So I'll put some padding top of 50, and that's just a good way of adding some space because I don't like that the new game is so close to the game board. All right, and there you have it. I think that's basically it for a tic-tac-toe game. I'll probably play around with it a little bit to test it out and see if there are any other bugs, but I think this is all we need for a tic-tac-toe game. This is kind of a beginner's tutorial, but I hope you found it helpful, and please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future.